He wrote some technical things when he was in his 30s. He was a local magistrate and he was appointed to a local government council which advised the region in which he lived on economic matters. And that's how he got interested in economics, looking at tax policy and the problems of French industry adjusting to tariff, the reintroduction of tariffs in the 1820s. But they were fairly insignificant and fairly superficial works. And it was only in his 40s, relatively late in life, because you have to realise that people didn't live as long as they do today. So living into your 40s or 50s was old age. So he's 44, 43, and he becomes interested in economic theory, economic policy, and starts writing on this in a very interesting and deeply read way. I mean, he based his early essays on considerable research and understanding of economic data, as well as a deep understanding of free market economic principles. He acknowledged a sort of trinity of thinkers from the Napoleonic and early Restoration period as having the most profound impact on him. One of them, of course, was Jean-Baptiste Say, who was the sort of the granddaddy of French political economy, who wrote his treatise in 1803. That was probably the determining text which laid the foundation for liberal French political economy for the rest of the century. The second and third persons were two lawyers and journalists, Charles Comte and Charles Dunoyer, who were writing in opposition to Napoleon, and then when Napoleon was overthrown, also writing in opposition to the restored monarchy. And they were, like Say and Comte and Dunoyer, were people that Bastiat constantly referred to as being seminal in the development of his own thinking. And one of their innovations, which I think was passed on to Bastiat, was they wanted to combine all the liberties into one overarching theory about liberty. So it wasn't just constitutional and legal liberty that they were interested in, but they wanted to add the social and economic dimensions of liberty which Say had inspired them with, and which they then incorporated into their writings in the late 20s and 30s. And this is something that Bastiat picked up and I think absorbed completely. Because one of the things that Bastiat says several times in his writings is that there are all these different freedoms that we can identify: political freedom, economic freedom, social freedom, but liberty with a capital L is the combination of all these freedom. And that's what I find most interesting about Bastiat. In fact, that makes him much more like modern libertarians today, who have this overall picture of how broad and all-encompassing liberty is. Whereas so many of the classical liberals of the 19th century, I think, were more compartmentalised in their thinking about the nature of liberty. What's interesting about Bastiat is when he does quote, you can see that there are influences from Italian political economists and Scottish political economists. He doesn't quote them. He does quote, however, literary figures. He loves quoting Molière and La Fontaine, which is interesting. Why does he not quote the great predecessors of economic thinking? I think it's a strategic choice that he makes. He began by trying to appeal to the broad audiences, the people who read the newspapers and magazines he wrote for. They were all schooled in the literary greats like La Fontaine and Molière, and so that was a way he could reach out to them and show them that there were these interesting economic lessons we could learn from reading La Fontaine in a particular way. He didn't quote Smith or Hume because the average reader would not appreciate that. Yet I wish he had been more open about the sources of his thinking. That would have been in his papers, but we do not know today whatever happened to his papers. They were collected and they were organised into the French edition of his collected works in the 1860s, but what happened to the originals, we never know. I just don't know what happened to them. I mean, I would love to be able to have access to those papers and see, for example, we know very little about any love life that he had. We know he was married and separated or from his wife. Perhaps he had a child. I suspect that he did have a flirtatious affair with one of the wealthy women who ran one of the liberals' salons in Paris. She also edited a collection of his correspondence to her some 27 years later. And it's in this book that we do see a more personal side to Bastiat. Her name was Hortense Chevreul. And if one were to have a lover, it would be appropriate to have someone named Hortense, I think. But he was so original in many ways, he shocked his colleagues, and they weren't quite ready for the avalanche of new ideas and thinking that just poured out of his pen in those very few years later in his life. Don Boudreau once wrote, because we were discussing this in our Liberty Matters discussion on Bastiat's thinking, and we were talking about the originality of Bastiat as both a social and political theorist. And Don Boudreau came up with this very witty argument, was that the reason why Bastiat was so innovative was he never went to graduate school. Right? He was never corrupted by having to study a set of texts that were approved and under the control and direction of a thesis supervisor who would perhaps vet what the graduate student would write about and how they would write about it. And Bastiat was completely free of that. He was an autodidact. He was, before he hit Paris in 1844, 1845, he'd spent 20 years or more just reading privately, arranging freely. Now, for some people that would be rather too close, not stimulating enough. But Bastiat his brain just filled with original ideas, and I think in 1844 his brain was already ready to explode. And it did. In the 5 or 6 years between 1844 and 1850, he wrote over 1 million words. But, he was dying in Paris, so he did pack up all his things under doctor's orders, took a boat to Rome, where he died on Christmas Eve, 1850. And as I said, I just wished he could have lived longer to finish his project.